I understand that people are affected by climate change, obviously, but for most people, it's still just an idea, really, isn't it? It's an ideology. It's like you either believe it or you don't. It's a flag to plant in the ground and to stand behind. The people that don't believe it are not going to be persuaded by being told they can't go skiing or snowboarding. In the same way, the people that are susceptible to not really believing coronavirus is that much of a threat aren't susceptible to being told that there's 100,000 people just died. You've got to deal with that side of human nature. That's my point. And that's a massive challenge for that movement.
Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well out there. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Stokely. Today, I get to speak with Matt Barr, host of Looking Sideways podcast. Looking Sideways podcast seeks to uncover the most interesting stories in action sports and other related endeavours. Matt's been working at this for a long time, and it really shows through in the quality of his guests and the conversations that he's able to have. So please check it out. Matt's also launched the new podcast, which has been going on for a number of seasons now, called Type 2. And that's run in association with Patagonia, and it explores the intersection between the outdoors, action sports, and activism. Again, I highly encourage you to check them out. But for now, let's have a listen to the conversation that me and Matt were able to have. Just want to put a little bit of a warning out there. This is definitely unfiltered, and there are definitely a lot of F-bombs that get dropped. So if you're sensitive to that kind of language, then I'd encourage you to listen with earmuffs. In closing, I would like to invite you to pay our respects to the traditional custodians upon the lands which this podcast has created, and I'd like to thank the humans and the other beings that keep the law of the land. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Thanks a lot for your time today. I really hope you enjoy the conversation, and please reach out to Matt or myself. So we can be found at Stokely Podcast on Instagram, and Matt can be found at wearelooking-sideways.com. So, thanks a lot for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Let us know what you think. Ciao for now.
What are we, 6 weeks in, maybe? And I think they're being pretty cagey over here, especially in England, because I don't know if, in the UK, we've got devolved governments. You've got the Scottish government and the Welsh government and the Northern Ireland government, actually. So they can make autonomous decisions, and they've been, firstly, they're less affected, and then they're also making much more transparent decisions. So in those countries, particularly in Scotland, they've been talking about the roadmap to get out of this situation, pretty openly. And in England, they're not really doing that. When they do the UK Parliament, they're just saying we've got these 5 tests, and when we pass those tests, then we'll let you know. So because they do these daily press conferences, which I shouldn't really listen to, but I end up listening to them every night because they're just a fucking wind up, to be honest. But last night they were saying we're not going to tell you, essentially. They just keep saying we're going to do the 5 tests, and when we do the 5 tests, we'll let you know. So the answer is everyone's guessing. So the latest thing everyone keeps talking about is the idea that you can have friends and family cells. So you can pick 10 people that you can hang out with. So if you got, see, my parents are down the road, so obviously they'd be 2 of the people I could see. And then you pick a couple of, if you've got kids, we don't have kids, but if you do have kids, you could pick friends that you could share childcare with. Because I think they're doing that in Belgium. So there's a little bit of talk about that. But probably you're in Melbourne, right? Is that right?
Yeah, just outside of Melbourne, yeah.
Maybe as it is in Australia, there's just a lot of pressure to get the economy moving. Because no one's working, and I don't know what they're doing over there, but over here they've underwritten everyone's salary to 80% for not everybody, but a large part of the population of getting their wages subsidised by the government up to 80% until the end of June, and obviously that's a shitload of money, and they're kind of already saying we can't do that after June. We literally will run out of money, so they will have to start moving things soon, I would think. So we get next week it's 3-week increments over here. when they review it. And I think a week today actually is when they review it again. But I'm expecting personally that it will carry on for another 3 weeks.
Yeah. Dude, that's hectic. Yeah. I mean, we look at some of the figures that are getting talked about over here, and it's, 130 billion or whatnot. But yeah, like when you compare our population to your population, it's just like trumps it. It's like almost 3 times. And you just think, geez, our numbers are big, but you guys must be up against some like serious figures for this whole thing. And then,
yeah, I think it's like 25,000 dead maybe at the minute. And they just, because it's kind of dull, isn't it? It's just all everyone's been talking about. But
yeah,
like they only recorded hospital deaths over here until yesterday, and then they started including care home and community deaths. So obviously that was a big controversy, because everyone was like, well, obviously there's more deaths than you're saying. So they adjusted it yesterday, and I think it went up by 3,000. So yeah, there's one of the big things over here is, like, 3 weeks ago, the chief medical officer said if we keep it under 20,000 deaths, it's a result, and it's over 20,000 deaths. So I think he's regretting saying that, because obviously the next day everyone was like, well, we're over 20,000. What are you saying now, mate? So yeah, it's I mean, I think that's the thing, isn't it? Everyone's getting like really inured to these, how actually colossal these numbers are. Because, there's more people died in America than died in the entire Vietnam War, and in the UK, the Northern Ireland conflict, which went on for 30 years, 3,000 people died in that, and that's like one of the defining stories of our country. 3,000, 25,000 people have died of COVID-19 already in like a month.
Yeah,
and when you put it in those terms, you do wonder what the kind of emotional payoff's going to be, because it's pretty colossal. It's a lot of people, it's a lot of death, and you can just be like, oh yeah, another 1,000 people died today, but it's a bit like, that's actually fucking mental.
Yeah,
when you think about it.
Yeah, man. And I think like it kind of when you apply the whole situation we're living in at the moment and focus in on small areas such as like the industry that you're working in, the industry that I work in, which have like, essentially in some areas come to a complete halt. You're just like, holy geez, like, this is something that's going to be written about in the history books, because it's like you alluded to, it's like that big,
Oh yeah, it's like, I mean, again, it's not an original observation, but it's like this is the last comparable thing is the Second World War, isn't it? And then economically, it's probably the Great Depression, which was 100 years ago. So
yeah,
may you live in interesting times, as they say.
Yeah, and like that, the Depression has been mentioned a number of times, hasn't it? Because no one wants to go there, but
no,
we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, how is it where you are?
It's like as you were saying before, like it seems somewhat pretty normal for the large majority. We've got a lot of outdoor space. I really do wonder sometimes how much they've cracked down on this whole lockdown thing, because I've seen a lot of people out doing kind of what they're doing, just in smaller groups, and it seems like everyone's like basically getting on with things, except just the restaurants and cafes and things like that are closed. This kind of part of the world's pretty big on that side of living and lifestyle, with restaurants and going out and whatnot. So I guess that's been a bit of a hit. But, like companies that do sports betting are now betting on the weather as opposed to betting on football games, which I find hilarious,
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how quickly people have adapted, isn't it? On every level, really, whether it's personally or, like you say, those sort of industries and means of behaviour. People have adapted pretty quickly, which is but I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time in Australia, and I can imagine the restaurants and cafes and bars being closed it's a big part of the culture, isn't it? Especially in the cities. Well,
you guys too, like the pub culture over there is just next level.
Yeah, well, that was when everyone knew shit was getting real. Like,
Yeah.
because Boris Johnson even said when he did his thing, is like, and yes, we're gonna have to shut the pubs,
Oh,
So that all joking aside, like that will be that could be, I've got a local around the corner which is just a tiny community boozer, which is just kind of like the local area living room. It's just where everyone goes, and I'd be if that pub survived, I'd be pretty amazed. They can't make a lot of money,
yeah.
and I can't believe that they're capable of lasting much longer. And over here, they're like, yeah, that's until Christmas, really. There's not going to be any bars open till then. So yeah, that could be
Wow.
quite sad, really, because I
Yeah.
think that a lot of those leisure industries, I think, are really getting decimated.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, like that's a culture. Like that is a deep ingrained part of the life over there, which is sad to think that this could really kill off a part of a culture,
Yeah, well, have you been to the UK? Have you
Yeah, I did. I lived over there for 4 years. So,
whereabouts?
yeah, mainly London. And then I was up in Aberdeen for like a year. Yeah.
All right. How's that?
Good
Cold?
times, man. Good times.
Yeah, never been to Aberdeen. Big
It's
oil town, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. When I first got sent up there, they were like, oh, they call it the Grey City. And then I got there, and the first taxi I was in, the guy's like, oh, we call this the Silver City. And I'm like,
Because it's all made out of granite, right?
yeah, largely, yeah. And that's where it's getting its name from. But,
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty funny. Yeah, I mean, like I saw more Ferraris and Lamborghinis in Aberdeen than I did in London when I was there. So
Yeah, I think it's like one of the richest towns in the UK for sure. Because
Yeah.
it's like the center of the UK oil industry, isn't it? So
yeah.
if I keep looking down here, by the way, it's just because I'm paranoid this isn't recording. So
Yeah.
but yeah,
I've
it looks
been
like
there,
it's
man.
fine. Yeah.
But yeah, hey dude, well, like thanks heaps for like I'm honestly like just stoked as to be able to chat to you, because I've been able to listen to like a lot of your podcasts, and dude, I'm like so blown away with the quality and what you do with Looking Sideways. It's so rad.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, it's just
That's
like
nice to hear.
yeah, and I'm sure you hear all the time, but it is just like a reinforcement that like it's I love the medium, and I think it's just great. Conversations are great, and this is what like this whole thing is about with Stokely. So yeah, and I'm just like kind of honored to be able to like have a chat to a bit of a master who's obviously been around the traps.
That's funny. Wow, man. Well, that's very kind of you to say. Yeah, it's funny because I got a message yesterday from someone I'm setting up an interview with, and he was like, "As a professional, would you recommend?" And I was like, "Fucking hell!" Like, that's just funny because like everybody, I very much don't feel like a professional. Well, I'm not. I do it in my spare time, and also, I don't think you ever feel like yourself, do you? I think you're always a bit like, oh right, okay, people are quite into this. That's nice, because I certainly don't. It's like I say, it's very kind of you to say, but it's probably not my own take on it.
Yeah, I guess like all elements of it are a work in progress continuously. Like
Yeah. I mean, that's why I've been into doing it, because it's a good way of, like challenging yourself. Like I've been doing these live ones since this has been going on. Like like every fucker's been doing these Instagram live things, haven't they? So I thought I'll do a few of them, because one of the things I've been, obviously like in the kind of real podcasts, your Rich Rolls and all that, they've got the studio, they do the film thing, it's a big production and all that. And over the years, I mean, I've been doing this 3 years, I've had people that listen to it say like, you should do video, and I've always been a bit like, fucking hell, like, it's hard enough doing the audio thing, let alone doing video as well. So when this came up, I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll give it a go, like it's a good little way of dipping the toe in. And it's really hard, like doing live stuff. But it's been cool to challenge myself again, and get thrown in at the deep end. And yeah, so that's kind of like all the way through it. That's been a big part of it, like just to try and learn and try things out.
Yeah, mate. And do you feel like like through doing podcasts, have you, I want to say grown a lot as a person yourself, but I guess like, have you had to put yourself out there in a way that you like really didn't feel comfortable?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a funny thing that because I've been doing, I've been a journalist since I was like, it's the first thing I did. I'm 43, and I've first thing I'd published was like 18. So I've been a journalist like my whole life, and so I've been interviewing people my whole life, really, my whole working life. But I never thought, I was talking to a friend about this the other day, like, I never for a minute thought I was any good at it. Like, it's literally never crossed my mind because it's just what I did for work. So when I've started doing the podcast, I didn't approach it like, oh yeah, I'm really good at this, I'm going to start a podcast of like, and that hasn't changed. Like I still find it challenging to get the best interview out of somebody, and I still feel like I have to approach each one as if it was the first one, like as if I don't take it for granted, like I try and approach it in a way that's gonna get the best result. And sometimes that can be quite hard. I'm lucky enough to interview friends a lot of the time, which obviously makes a massive difference because you can just immediately be comfortable. But a lot of the time I'm interviewing people that are used to controlling that situation, because they might be media trained, or they might not know who I am, for whatever. There's millions of reasons why. So yeah, it's challenging to go in and get something out of it is still hard. And so yeah, I feel like, to answer your question, that's a constant thing that, like, I don't think that'll ever end.
I guess going back a bit, it sounds like, I think a good quote for that to summarize it would be what, like, the teacher is always the student or something. You sound like you've definitely got that ability to have the overall awareness that you're still learning, yet, a lot of people do consider you to be quite experienced in the game. Like, and of course, I mean, that's a long time working in the field of journalism, and like, and I guess it's all been more or less like action sports, because it would be rad to kind of get a bit more of like a background onto your like entry into that space, and then how you've gone from being 18 to now 43. Like, you've got to have some pretty sweet adventures in that, man. A couple of good stories.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of has always been action sports, although I have written a lot over the years about everything, really, as you do, when I've written a lot for like newspapers and magazines and stuff about various things over the years. Yeah, like I got into it through snowboarding, really, and skateboarding. Like which listeners of my podcast are probably really bored of hearing me mention, but so I'm from Manchester and got into skateboarding when I was about 14. So that's like 1990. There's not a lot of culture back then around that. So in the UK, there's like a very, very influential and tight-knit media back then, which was very influential on me and very influential on a lot of people my age, which I've kind of discovered when I talk about it on the podcast, because people always get in touch and go like, oh God, I read that, or I did that as well. So essentially, like, when I got into snowboarding, which is a little bit later, I kind of just I had friends that were like really good snowboarders, and the UK scene was so small, and it's literally like about 50 to 100 people, at that time. So the way that I got a break, if you like, was a friend of mine was getting an interview in a UK snowboarding magazine called White Lines. And he asked, and I was like, oh, can I do it? Actually, no, it's a different magazine. It's called Snowboards UK. But anyway, like, similar story. And he was like, yeah, I'll ask him. And they let me do it. So I was 18 then, and they really liked it. And they were like, you should do more of this. It kind of went from there, really. So, and that was when I was at university. So I kind of look back on those skate mags that I grew up with, and I just sort of copied what they did, really, because that's because I thought, well, and that's what we all did back then. So then I ended up working for that magazine that I mentioned, White Lines. So I wrote for them when I was at university on and off, and I started writing more and more about like snowboarding and skateboarding and, you know, action sports. Because at the time, you know, in the mid 90s, obviously it was very novelty. So it was getting a lot of, especially in the UK, so it's getting like a lot of mainstream attention. And if you could write about it, you tended to get commissioned, really. So that's kind of where it came from. And then when I finished university, I was a bit like, okay, what am I going to do now? So I was 21 at that point. And I got offered a job at a newspaper actually in Sheffield, which is where I was living at the time. And I really seriously thought about taking it. But then I was a bit like, so me and this friend of mine, a guy called Chris Moran, who's like really very close mate of mine. He's the guy that was getting interviewed in the magazine and was like a big, you know, bit older than me, bit of a mentor to me over the years, especially when I was younger. He was a bit, and he could write as well. And he was a bit like, well, why don't we just pitch White Lines and see if we can like just sort of run it, you know? And I was a bit like, oh, right, yeah, I guess we could do that. So we went down there, we drove down and sort of just pitched him really. We went down there and we were like, well, how about you pay us a bit of money, like pay us your budget that you've got for the year and we'll just do the whole thing. And they were like, okay, that sounds cool. Because they didn't have anything else to do. It was either they were going to have to like handle lots of small freelancers or they would hire us to do it. So they did. They went for it, and it was fuck all money. It was really, I think it was like a couple of grand each they paid us, but we used that money to then pay to go and do a season. So we went in the French Alps because that's what we really wanted to do, wanted to go snowboarding. So we used that money. We got a chalet because you could get a chalet for like 500 quid for the season back then. So we had a 500 quid for the chalet, 500 quid for the lift pass, and then we had £1,000 to spend, and you could kind of do a season on £1,000. So we basically moved to France and we ran the magazine from there. And when we were out there, we got the material for the magazine. So we did trips. We had mates out there who were photographers, like a really good friend of mine, Nick Hamilton, who ended up going on to like edit Transworld Snowboarding and is, you know, proper legend in the game. He was like 17 and he was out there and he was doing pictures, so we would do stories together. So it kind of went from there. So we did that for like, I ended up doing that for pretty much 10 years. Like we did, and then the magazine grew and we got a bit more money. So for the first few years I'd have to work in the summer, so I'd just come home and get like shit jobs and try and work at being a journalist as well. You know, I used to just like buy magazines and like kind of go through and see what stories they were printing. I mean, I used to write letters. That's how long ago this was. I used to like hand write letters to people. And then from that started getting commissioned and started to sort of create a network, you know. And then, like I said, I ended up doing White Lines for about 10 years. That was always the sort of foundation. And then as that magazine, like I said, got bigger, then we got a kind of a proper wage, so we could do it year round. And then we started using it as an opportunity to travel really, like properly. So we would, because, you know, you'd have to plan the magazine for what you'd do is you'd meet in May, if I remember rightly, because we did 6 issues. We had 6 issues. We had the first one come out in September and then the last one come out in February. So we'd meet in May and we'd kind of plan the year. And then the first deadline was always like end of August or end of July even. So you'd kind of be doing it in the summer. But then the good part about it was at the same time, you'd be like, and where do we want to go next season? You know, so we'd then plan the next winter. So we'd get together in May and we'd plan the 6 months of the magazines that we had to finish, but then we'd plan the next year's worth of travel that would contribute to the next 6 months. And that was obviously the best part. So then we'd finish the magazine and basically like decide where we wanted to go snowboarding, which was brilliant, you know. So yeah, I ended up doing that for about 10 years in the end, but most of my 20s really.
I mean, to me, it sounds like, you know, that is really following your passion. You know, like you're not doing it for cash. You said that you got offered a job. What was it that you studied at university?
English literature.
Mm-hmm. So like, you did have some kind of clue about writing, I'd assume, with doing something like that. And then,
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to write in some way since I was a kid, since I was a really young kid, like I kind of, that I decided that's what I wanted to do when I was quite young, but I always like assumed that I would end up being a journalist, like working for a newspaper or whatever. And that's why when I got offered that job, I did consider it because that's the path that I thought I would follow. But obviously the opportunity to follow a different path and go snowboarding was, when I was 21, was much more appealing. So that's what I did. Yeah.
And then, but you still got to kind of merge those two passions together.
Yeah, I've got to give my friend Chris a lot of credit for that, because Chris was the one that had the idea. Like, he was the one that, and he was a real mentor to me back then, because he's still like one of my closest mates, but he was a bit older than me. He'd had a successful snowboarding career in the UK, and he still did at that point. He was like super highly regarded snowboarder in the UK. He's still like a proper legend of British snowboarding. And he had the vision for that. Like, he was the one that said, yeah, we should do this. Like, and I was a bit like, really? Like, we can do that? And then even when we would do it the first couple of years, like, I kind of learned most of it from him, because it was, and when I say that, I mean the blagging side. I wouldn't have had the confidence really to go to that magazine and ask to make that deal, and then to use that money to do that first season, if he hadn't have basically said, no, we can do this. That was really important, because that gave me the confidence and then obviously I did a year, and I was like, oh right, yeah, fuck, you can do this. Like, so, and then after that we kind of rinsed it, for the next sort of decade. But yeah, that was definitely important.
I think it's so interesting. You've done some incredible interviews on your podcast, right? Like, you're up to, I think, 121, I think, or up. You've probably recorded more, but you've released around about 120. And they're not just, random podcasts. They're podcasts of, some of the sports, in whatever chosen sport they've gone, the best of the best legends. And I kind of can't help but see how what you've done is something that's pretty common in sport as a whole. Like, a lot of sports, you're not really getting paid a whole bunch, especially when you first start out. But it's all about, having just a bit of belief, bit of love, passion, just getting after that for whatever unreasonable reason you can drum up in your mind to convince yourself to do it. Like, have you seen your story within other people's stories in your time recording and interviewing people?
How do you mean?
Like, so I've done a lot of trail running, right? Like, I had an offer to continue doing a job, which was really, really well paid and all of that. And a good friend of mine who was British, and he said, hey, why don't you come out to the French Alps and do a season out here? We'll trail run. We'll train for Ultra Trail Mont Blanc, which is the 100-mile race around the Mont Blanc Massif.
Did you do that?
Yeah. And I was just like,
wow.
Like, there was something there that was completely unreasonable. It totally didn't make sense on so many pieces of paper.
Sorry, I'm with you. So, like, have I seen that sort of theme in the stories of the people that I've interviewed?
Yeah.
Like, it's really common. Yeah, I'd say it's like, probably, well, there's a few themes that have evolved over the years, and that you're right. That's definitely extremely common. I think in the States, particularly in California, it's a bit different, because and probably in Australia as well, if you look at something like surfing and skateboarding now, it is a path, isn't it? You can do it. Like, it. Yeah. If you want to, for an Aussie kid to grow up thinking they want to be a surfer or work in that industry, is probably fairly accepted, and I'm not going to say conventional, but particularly, like, people my generation who grew up in unlikely places, it's really common, because you do have to make that decision. You do have to, like you've just described with the decision that you made, yeah, like you have to make that choice. At some point, you have to take the punt. You know, you've got to say like, actually, yeah, I'm just going to do that because that's what I want to do rather than what I feel like I should do. So yeah, it's extremely common.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective on it because, so yeah, like you said, you've been in the journalism industry for like just over 20 years in action sports predominantly, and you must have seen such a big change in regards to, you know, like what media even constitutes. And now you've got all these other things like social media, digital content, et cetera, et cetera. You know, like what's your perspective, or how do you sum up like how you've seen that all change? Because like you said, you know, being a legitimate like pro surfer is something that you can do now. Like it's a career. People actually look at it and go, hey, you're a pro surfer? Like that's pretty cool. Good on you. But like there's also a huge element of like you can be a pro surfer and be the best of the best, but you can also be like a pretty good surfer, like on the pro circuit, maybe never going to win the title, but you've got like 6.2 million Instagram followers and you pump out content like no one's business. And that is even more of a job than this like pro surfer thing. So I'd love to hear your like, yeah, your you know, history overseeing that change.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things to say about that. I guess firstly, the thing that I used to think was a bit of a disadvantage for me personally, I worked in a real niche, ended up being a huge advantage. You know, I remember, I say that in the context of this arc of change that you're describing in terms of the media landscape, if you like, and the general landscape as you describe it. Because back then, when I was starting out, there was a journalism industry, you know, there was a traditional media industry, and us chipping away with our weird little snowboard and action sports shit was seen as a bit kooky, really, and it was a bit. But obviously, those niches are now the things that have thrived, and the mainstream traditional media has been subsumed by different media, if you like. You know, if you think of the mainstream landscape, obviously newspapers, TV, you know, that's dramatically, wildly different than 20 years ago. So personally speaking, like I say, I've realized that that was actually a real plus for me, because my little corner of it, this niche that I work in, yeah, it's changed, but essentially it's still the same storytelling and it's still the same, as if you like. So I think that's something that I've kind of realized. The other thing I'd say is, though, it doesn't really matter what the format is. The second thing I'd say is like it still does come down to, is the story any good and can you tell it well? And I think that's the same for somebody who does what I do, or that surfer with the Instagram followers that you described, you know, because some people are very good at Instagram, let's just say, and they're very good at telling stories in that medium. And as a result, they've got huge audiences, you know, because for whatever you think of it, that audience likes the story that's being told. So you can't really front on that, I don't think. I don't tend to be snobbish about that because I recognize it for what it is. I might not agree with it. It might not be for me, and often it's not for me, but you know, like it still comes down to somebody telling a story really, really well. And then obviously the third point is, again, a real sort of unoriginal observation, but it's just changed the power, hasn't it, of how you can tell these stories, because you don't need those gatekeepers anymore. You know, you don't need those traditional, you don't need permission to tell a story in the same way that you used to do. And that's something that I was very much had at the front of my mind when I started the podcast, because, you know, my generation, I guess it'd be Generation X, you know, like we kind of like straddle both worlds, right? You know, I grew up with traditional media and traditional media gatekeepers. You know, if you wanted to be a musician, you needed a record deal. If you wanted to be a sponsored athlete, you needed a sponsor to give you money. If you wanted to be a journalist, you needed an outlet to give you permission to write that story. Obviously, it's not like that now. You know, if you want to tell a story, you can get an Instagram account and accrue 600,000 followers if you're any good, you know. And I think, you know, I spent my life pitching and essentially like asking for permission. And over the, you know, please can I write a story in your magazine? Because and that's the work of a journalist, especially a freelance journalist. That's the work of any creative who's trying to pitch, whether you know, and that can be really dispiriting because it doesn't matter how good your story is. Often, a lot of the time, there are things that you don't understand that add up to why you don't get accepted in whatever world you try to get accepted in. You know, these gatekeepers that you try to bypass, if you like. And when I came to set up the podcast, I was very much like, actually, I don't need anyone's permission to do this because I have been doing this a long time and I do feel like I kind of know how to tell stories. And I'm just going to kind of do it all myself, you know, because at one point I thought, oh, well, maybe I could pitch a snowboarding magazine and say, hey, can I do a podcast for you? Which would have been the traditional approach, you know. But then I was just a bit like, well, fuck that. I don't need to do that because I could probably do it, you know, without sounding like a cock. Like I felt like I could do it better than they could do it, you know, because of the amount of time I'd been doing it. So I think all of those three things, there's probably more, but off the top of my head, that's what I would say really. Because I think it's really positive now, personally, you know, the way that the landscape is. And this is another theme that comes up quite a lot, particularly when I talk to fellow sort of old farts like myself who've been around this for a while. You know, I was talking to this lad, Mike Manzouri, in a podcast the other day. He's a British skateboarder. And he was the same. He's a filmmaker. And I did questions for him on Instagram, which I don't do that often, but I did in his case. And one of the questions was actually from a really well-known pro skater. And he said, what does Mike feel about, he kind of asked the same question that you're asking, you know, what's your perspective on the changing media landscape? And Mike kind of said the same thing. He was a bit like, you know, if you told me when I was 18 that I'd have a little fucking computer in my pocket that had every skate video in history on it that I could watch at the touch of a button, I'd have been pretty stoked, you know. And I got to agree with that, really. Yeah, there's a lot of certainly a lot of shit out there, you know, and there's a lot of stuff, like I say, that just isn't for me. But I don't think it's a bad thing. I think the opportunities. Like, I couldn't have done the podcast 20 years ago. No way. You know, I wouldn't have been able to get access to the technology and there wouldn't have been the platforms for me to do it. Whereas now, I mean, I'm in my bedroom, which is where I do a lot of them at the minute under lockdown. And you can do it all really easily. You know, and again, it's not an original thing to say, but that's got to be a positive thing, I think.
Yeah, I think, you know, you've definitely dropped a couple of nuggets of gold in there for people that are interested in this like side of the world. You know, story is king. Like, there's no doubt about it. Whenever you look at content and you look at what really strikes a tune, it always comes down to story. And like you say, if you can tell it well, that's a huge bonus. And I think, you know, and it, you know, if you can't tell it well, it's still, if you've got a story, then that's like what people are going to catch on to. You know, you can have insanely good production, you know, amazing sound quality, which all help. But if you've got no story, people really just don't like connect on a deeper level, and stuff just doesn't really go too far. But like, you know, you've been in this industry and you do a lot of work. I wanted to bring up your actual company a little bit later on, but like, it's amazing when you like go to your website on like All Conditions Media and see the stuff that you guys do. But do you have any like advice for that younger generation of you know, like kids that might, or teenagers that might be really even older dudes, like even some old kooks that are still talented and they reckon they can still like pull it off? And I'm talking about guys that, you know, who knows, they might be 25 and they feel like they've missed their time, but they still have some like incredible passion to get into like being somewhat of a sponsored athlete or being on a circuit. After everything you've seen, like what are the what's the advice that you can give to someone who still has the energy to back themselves and follow through with like trying to make it happen?
Yeah, I guess. Well, I guess you got to do the thing. You know what I mean? Like you got to actually do whatever it is that you think you should be doing, and not be worried about it being shit. I think it's really important, and it comes down to that like inner critic thing, doesn't it? I guess like a good analogy is like, again, how I set up Looking Sideways, and as I said earlier, like I didn't go into that thinking this thing's going to be fucking great. I really didn't. I didn't even, and I'm not like that is genuinely how I felt. Like I was a bit like, fuck, is anyone going to like listen to this? Also, is my voice going to be really annoying? Do I make too many weird noises when I speak? Do I say too much? All that stuff that's like your inner critic like going on in your head. But I just had to try and ignore that and do it. And I've done stuff over the years in my life that haven't worked, like everybody, so I think that's ultimately you just have to put yourself out there. And again, that's a pretty glib thing to say, but it is true. And don't be concerned about it. It might well be shit when you start, but you can't be worried about that because firstly, people are pretty forgiving. And secondly, it's the only way you learn. I'm really thankful that there was no digital media around. I'm really grateful that all the White Lines magazines we wrote over 10 years aren't online, because when I think back to a lot of it, it was fucking awful. We were like 20-year-old kids in the French Alps. When I think back, it was fucking insufferable, a lot of it. But like, that's fine. We were learning. We made loads of mistakes, and we got a lot of shit a lot of the time. We definitely weren't as clever as we thought we were, or as funny as we thought we were. But that's all fine, because that's how you learn. That's how you get somewhere. So I think I would say you have to do the thing, and you have to just try and do it your best and throw yourself into it. And I did have something else to say about that, but I can't quite remember it right now. So maybe I'll try and come back to it.
Yeah, that's cool, man. When you do, just chime in, and I'll let you take the mic. I just wanted to read something, because it's so interesting to see the reason why people do things, and you've spoken to a lot of incredible athletes, and I think that they must all have some pretty, the large majority have some pretty like meaningful stories, or just, it doesn't have to be meaningful, but meaningful to the person themselves about why they do what they do. And so like on your website for All Conditions Media, I found it really awesome to read the Us section. And I just want to read it out because like I feel like you've summed up what you do pretty damn well. And it goes on to say, action sports, adventure travel, outdoors, like millions of others, we've based our lives and careers around the things we love. So we created All Conditions Media to represent the cultures that have been so good to us in the most meaningful way possible, by only working with innovative, technical, or heritage companies and brands who share our values. We take their stories to a wider audience in the most credible way we can and help them provide that growing community with experiences that will enhance their lives. Why is that so important to you?
That's a really good question, actually. Firstly, thanks for taking the time to read that, because it's always nice to hear that people have taken that on board. But that is a really good question, because that goes to the heart of, so what that's about is very much about where I've been coming from this whole thing with my whole life. And so the opportunity that I think we had when I was a kid trying to get into journalism was there was so much shit out there. There was so much bad content, which obviously it wasn't called that then, but about action sports. We've all seen them. Every time the Olympics comes out, it's like, hey, the guide to snowboard speak. And that there's like landfill amounts of that shit, and especially in the 90s. And it used to just wind us up. You know, we just used to be like, and everyone knows that when they're really into something, and then you see someone like just take a look at it and be patronizing about it and whatever. So our pitch that we had when we were pitching mainstream was always like pretty aggressively like, that's fucking shit. You don't know what you're talking about. And also you're not respecting the thing that we do and we know about, and we can do it way better. And I'd say that had about a 50% hit rate because, you know, sometimes people would be go, oh, yeah, fair enough. But a lot of the time people would be like, yeah, whatever, fuck off. We don't care, because they didn't care. You know, that's the point. But that was always, I've always felt really strongly about that. And I've always very much annoyed people about that, and annoyed, I think, a lot of my friends that I've worked with about that, because I've banged that drum so hard. But I do think it's important. And I feel like the more mainstream these cultures go, it's never been more important. You know, you're going to see it in surfing and skateboarding, which is like this very well-worn argument right now. But these cultures, when they get exposed to mainstream interaction, if you like, they do change. You know, we all know that. It doesn't matter what it is. Like, as soon as, and that's fine. They're allowed to change. They should change. Things need to evolve. But when you get people that don't understand it, that come in and start to have an influence on that change, that needs to be fought back against, because that's what irrevocably changes these cultures, and not always for the better, because there will be people that come in who don't have the right motives in mind. And that's the story as old as fucking time. You know what I mean? But like, that's what that's about. So ACM came about, All Conditions Media. So I founded it with Chris, the guy I mentioned earlier. So and this is also quite linked to what you were talking about in terms of like the evolution of the landscape and all that. So basically, when White Lines ended for us, which was a bit shit at the time, it didn't end on great terms, but you know, whatever. And that was like 2005, and we decided to leave. And again, it was a bit like I was a bit gutted, because, you know, I had this great job, like 10 years fucking around for a living, going snowboarding. So it's a bit like, really? Fuck, we got to give this up. So we came up with the idea of ACM. And at the time, it was meant to be a writing agency, because you could sell freelance copywriting and journalism as a legitimate business model based around representing these cultures effectively in mainstream. So that was the pitch. That was what we were like, okay, we'll set this up and we'll just do this, rather than just do this for White Lines, we'll do this like freelance. So for the first few years of ACM, it was completely different than what it is now. It was me, Chris, an Aussie guy actually called Ben Mundy. He used to edit tracks. He's a very close friend of mine. And we set it up, and we were a bit like, yeah, fuck it. We're going to be like a freelance action sports writing agency. And that did work for a while. And then as things went on, it evolved, because that is marketing essentially. And brands started asking us to work with them. And then brands obviously were like, well, we've got this other thing, which is like a marketing project. And, you know, obviously those skills are very transferable. So it began to evolve into a marketing agency quite naturally. And the pitch was still the same as you read out and as it was before. Because the other thing that I kind of realized, so I guess it got to like the year 2010 even, and I was a bit like, all right, there's a proper opportunity. Like, we could actually become we could actually set up a marketing agency here. And what I realized was it's the same pitch, because when I was a journalist on White Lines, the amount of PR agencies and marketing agencies we got pitched by that were fucking clueless, and they were representing the biggest action sports brands in the world, you know. So we'd be getting pitched these brands that we knew, and our friends ran them, and we'd be like, man, you can't say that. You can't pitch a journalist and say that about snowboarding. You can't. So that was the pitch. So, you know, we were like, when I was a bit like, right, I'm actually going to give this a proper go. I kind of understand what the opportunity is with All Conditions Media, and I'm going to go all in and just basically change it from this writing agency to a marketing agency. It was the same pitch, really. It was like, yeah, you don't want to work with them because they haven't got a fucking clue and they're representing you really badly. It's the same thing, they're taking you out to the mainstream and they're giving the mainstream this like just wrong idea about what we are, what we stand for, and then that's getting printed. So that's how it evolved, really. And then that's always been the kind of the thing behind All Conditions Media, because it's a marketing agency at the end of the day. Like it's not you've got a person that I need to, if I'm going to feel good about that work, I need to do that in the best possible way that I can. And I need to just do work that I kind of believe in and that follows through the stuff that I've been doing my whole life around these sports and lifestyles. So that is kind of real. Like, when we say we don't want to work with brands, that's true. Like, if we don't think that brands get it, or we won't work with them. And equally, we try and be confident about telling people we're not right for them, which happens a lot because, they're not going to like what we try and do.
Yeah, I think, some of the hardest things, one of the hardest things to do is to say no, to be able to, back yourself in that way as well and be able to say, this is just not right. I've got a couple of things to say to that. And one would be, like, thank you for having the foresight to know that there is such thing as a like genuine culture within sports that really does resonate through any kind of communication, be it a conversation, be it marketing. I spent a lot of time working with a company recently, and it got really tough. Like it got to the point where like naturally for me, trail running was my thing, and then ultra distance, it just kind of happened as a natural feeling and curiosity. And it got to the point where you're working with people that are kind of governing what gets put out there in terms of content and media from an office, and they're 100% more involved in surfing and like doing triathlons. And it's just, and like you said, like it's fine. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I don't want to belittle what they do or anything like that. It's just, it can just be painful because you've got something that at the core of your being you love, and you just enjoy it for what it is. And then it can be like the tone of that and everything that goes with it can just be like stripped away and be really inauthentic. And you're just like, oh man, this is like brutal that this thing I love, be it a sport or, anything, is getting like tainted in that kind of a way because it's not, it doesn't seem genuine, or it's not coming from a genuine place. So I think, so what I was saying is thank you, because that is really, really important to hold those core values and core beliefs about sports in a very high place, like, or else they will get changed. And some people will not be able to enjoy them for the same reasons that someone like yourself or someone like I got to enjoy them, which I believe is like a really like, authentic way of enjoying something without the BS that goes around it, because at the end of the day, they're trying to sell this product, but they're coming up with some manipulative or like strange new age kind of way to sell it, where at the end of the day, it's like, you got to get out and run.
I do have something to say about that, actually, thinking about what you've just said. And it might even sound a bit contradictory with everything that I've just said. The other thing I would say, because you kind of said, is there anything that I've learned, any advice, whatever? I do think you got to learn to pick your battles to win the war. And I mean that when you work in as particularly, because like if I give you an example, right? So and one of the things I really cringe about when I think back to White Lines, that magazine needed advertising to pay for it. Like back then, we didn't sell a lot of copies, and we used to they fucking must have hated us, those ad guys, because, we would like, we thought our job was to take the piss out of that commercial side of it. So, and that got us and them into a lot of trouble. And, you know, I remember one of the things that happened was one of the big surf brands spent a lot of money every month advertising in White Lines, and they sent us a pink jumper to review. And we wrote this review that was like, absolutely, you know, it was just like, what the fuck are they sending us this piece of shit for, pretty much, you know, which we thought was funny. And that was the whole shtick. And, you know, they phoned up the magazine and were like, if you don't tell them to fuck off, we're going to pull all our ads, you know. And my boss at the time phoned me up and was really like, you know, you like, what are you doing? You know, you're like, and I just didn't really take that seriously. And now when I think back, like, I regret that. And also what I regret is I didn't really get it, because like there's a line to tread, and you can get better at that line, and it's important. So as much as I've kind of come out with all that gung-ho sort of fight the power, like fucking represent our culture in the right way stuff, which I completely believe, an equally important part of your ability to like have a career in an industry like this, and also to protect those cultures in the way that you want, is understanding how to play that game in the right way. And I certainly, that's taken me, you know, that's probably like the most important thing you can learn, really. And like in any walk of life, in any job, like, and I've certainly got friends who haven't learned that effectively, who are incredible creatives, who are like the amazingly talented, should be much more rewarded than they are. They've never learned that game, and they end up closing doors that should be open for them, and they end up, you know, getting frustrated, really, because they don't, you know, because their instinct is just to push back all the time. And like I say, you got to choose when to do that. So I just, you know, it's just in relation to what we're talking about generally, but I do think it's an important point, because, you know, an athlete needs a sponsor. An athlete, like sports clubs, need sponsors. Like, you know, money unfortunately is required for these things, especially commercially. Not the act of doing them, and I would separate those things, and I do separate those things. I'm not talking about the act of going surfing or snowboarding as an individual. I'm talking about the industry of these things. And, you know, like or not, and it's a fucking endless debate in surfing, isn't it? You know, the commercial end of surfing, that is real, you know. And if you're going to engage in that, then you need to understand it's not all about that. You know, you've got to be careful about when you play that card, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is, you know, we said before, story is king, and being able to play the game is also king. Like, there's some big takeaways, 100%. And yeah, it can be like grinding up against sandpaper sometimes. It totally goes against your grain, and it's just like nah. But yeah, like you say, choose your battles for the overall, you know, the overall benefit to our community or our culture is like, you know, is when you win the war. And sometimes you got to, zip your mouth shut and get on with it. But
I know when to walk away, you know, like know when it's just, you know, in hindsight, leaving White Lines was the right decision. Didn't want to do it at the time, but knowing when to walk away and knowing when to just admit something needs to change is also like massively important. Like, forward movement of any kind is really important. Personally, for my mental health, but also just generally to keep doing what you want to do. You know, like, yeah, the timing of those things is really important. Definitely.
Yeah, and exactly right. Like, you know, once you strip it all back, at the end of the day, you got to go to bed by yourself with your own mind and your own values. And sometimes it's better just to walk away and drop that. And, you know, you're only going to open up doors if you close some other doors. You know, like, we've only got a finite capacity to handle so much. And, when those doors align with your values more, then that's a great thing. And like we said before, sometimes the hardest thing to say is no. No matter how shiny and beautiful that thing looks, it's just kind of like, I've got to turn this one down, because it's just, for whatever reason, circumstance has it that it's just not going to be today. Like, yeah, I mean, it's great to know that someone like yourself who's been through, so many examples to be able to put in a podcast that can still have that train of thought as well. I think it's pretty important, pretty important to put out there. Did, with all the conversations you've been able to have with Looking Sideways, are there some that really remain with you and stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the ones that I've personally enjoyed, like, there's a couple of things going on with them, isn't there? There's like delivering a good like snapshot of what that person's like, which is satisfying journalistically. Like the last episode I did is with Terry A. Harkinson, who's, pretty much considered to be the most influential snowboarder of all time. And he's a friend of mine, and it's been a pain in the arse to get off the ground. And also, like, he's quite a complicated man. So there was a lot of things about that were difficult to deliver something journalistically that was true, So I'm pleased with that, because I feel like that happened. And, there's that, but then there's equally just the conversations that I personally really enjoy, because the topics that I feel comfortable discussing, and they're probably the ones, to be honest, not the most exciting answer in the world, but like you said, and I've listened to your podcast, and you're putting the art of conversation, if you like, front and center as like the theme of it. And yeah, like they're the ones, if I just meet somebody, especially that I've never met, and we can just have like a great conversation, and then within 5 minutes I can be like, I can relax, this is going to be fine, then they're the ones that kind of stick with me, really. Like it keeps coming back, this one, because I was interviewed for something else today, and they asked not the same question but a similar question, and I said Peterson and Norton then as well, and that's the one that's just coming to my mind. So they're like the surf journalist and surf photographer. They're in the 60s now, who in the early 70s did this amazing road trip. It was like 10 makes what I talked about earlier sound fucking laughable. They traveled Africa, South America, like the original endless summer surf road trip for Surfer magazine. It's a hugely influential period in surf journalism, and they're around, those guys. And I wrote a book about 15 years ago about surf culture, and I interviewed them for that, and they were legends. This was kind of like, I think we did it over email. It's probably like about 2003, 2004. So, and they were great, and they were just really stoked that like some random English guy wanted to tell their story. So when I went to California last year, I was like, I've got to find those two. So I just emailed them and said, all right, do you remember me? And I don't think they did, but they very politely said that they did. And then I went to see him and I interviewed him, and it was brilliant, because they were just like so thrilled to talk about their story, which is amazing, by the way. And it was just great. It was just a really great conversation, and I really liked the fact that I got to tell a new load of people about their story, because when I put that episode out, everyone was like, how the fuck have I not heard of this? Especially with the pictures, because the pictures are crazy, because they were both like amazing surfers, and they're surfing some of the most famous waves in the world on their own, like in 1970. And Craig's an amazing photographer, so the pictures are fantastic, and they've got the stories coming out their ears. So that was great. That was like on a like, journalistically, personally, and the act of just meeting them and having a chat with them was really great.
Do you, we've mentioned the word legend so many times in relation to the people that you've been able to interview, but I mean, who inspires you when you speak to these people? Has anyone inspired you, or how's that been?
In what way?
I guess, so to give an example is like within running, a lot of people ask, hey, like, who inspires you or what inspires you? I mean, that guy who wins all those races must be super inspiring. And I'm like, you know what? At the end of the day, it's like when I'm driving in a car or riding on a bike and I go past someone who looks incredibly unrunning like, and they are running down a path and it's pouring rain and they look like they're not really enjoying it, but they're out there doing it. Like, that is the person that I look at and go, that's fucking inspiring.
Yeah. I guess like I just like good work done well, really. I like it. You can just see that somebody's put everything into it and it's been executed really, really well. Like they're the sort of things that inspire me. I don't really have people that, it's a bit like you're saying, like, the runner that you can see is like getting the most person out of what they do. I think it's quite linked to my, for better or worse, I've kind of realized the older I've got, like my self-esteem is linked to my feeling that I am working hard, which is really fucking weird. Like, and I only kind of realized that as I got older. Like, I find it quite difficult to not do stuff, and it drives my wife mad. She's always a bit like, fucking sit down. Like, but I kind of realized that I don't know who can explain these things. That's just part of who I am. I've come to understand. So I get the most satisfaction out of when I personally work hard at something and feel like I did it to the best of my ability, really, and I admire that in other people. I guess that's the answer.
I'm quite interested to know, looking sideways has got the type 2 kind of collaboration going with Patagonia, and that strikes me as a bit of a standout, mainly because with your history in sports journalism, you've got a lot of connections, I assume. You don't seem like that much of a ball bag. So I'm sure you've got some, you've been able to hold on to some good connections, right? And I just think it's so interesting. Well, I would love to hear why you landed and chose to partner with Patagonia on like a collaborative effort to through the medium of the podcast.
Yeah. Okay. So initially I had a problem with the podcast, which was like how to finance it. You know what it's like. It takes time and money. You do a podcast. You know what the trade-off is in terms of putting it out. So,
yeah, I mean, MeUndies has contacted me like 9 times, and I'm like, geez, I don't know if I can do it. Like,
yeah, exactly. So I immediately, like day one, I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that because it's just fucking shit, and I can't imagine the money they're going to pay me is going to be worth it. So, and I was lucky because obviously I could fit it around work. So originally, I travel a lot in normal times I travel a lot with work. And as you've sort of described, my work is it's the same ballpark. So, initially it was like if I was at a trade show, I'd do episodes. If I was, so I made it work that way. And I didn't need to like take any ads. But like you, by the sounds of it, I got offered loads of collaborations, and I got offered collaborations from sort of action sports brands as well. And I just said no because I didn't want to do them, and I didn't want to. If you enter into any kind of partnership like that, it inevitably changes things. That's just a fact of these transactions. So when Patagonia thing came along, there's a few reasons why I decided to do that. Firstly, the people involved are friends of mine, so that helped, just because I like them, and I never actually worked with them. So they kind of approached me, and so I was intrigued on just on that personal level because I like those people, and I thought, oh, cool, so maybe we could find a project to work on. Secondly, I was not averse to getting paid to do something because at the time I'd invested a lot of money into it. Not literally, but like I say, as cheesy as it sounds, your time is money. So I was like, yeah, cool. I don't not want to get paid for this. Like if I can earn some money, that's great. And then thirdly, the way that they went about it was really impressive because they basically said, look, we don't really have an idea. We just like what you do, and we want to do something, so let's just have a chat. And that went on for about 9 months. Like, we just basically when we'd be in the same place, we would meet and discuss it. And that idea basically evolved from that. And all the way through that process, they didn't put pressure on me once. They were very much like, you clearly know what you're doing. So we'll just, if we think the idea that we come up with ticks our boxes, then we'll let you take the lead. So I was impressed with that, to be honest, because I can't tell you how rare that is in working with brands. Like you've sort of pointed out, I've been working with brands in similar contexts for 25 years, and that was the most confident like interaction I've ever had with a brand, really, which you would probably expect from that company, I think. So that was kind of why. And then so we agreed to do 3 pilots just to see what it was like, and and it went down really well. So we decided to carry on doing it, really. And all the way through, it's been, if either party wants to sort of curtail it, then we'll be fine with that, really. So, and then we'd been doing those Type 2 live things on a Friday. I've been doing them, which is basically, like I was saying earlier, like the live Instagram things. And yeah, again, it was really similar. It was just a bit like, should we give that a go? Like we had to cancel a few events, obviously, because of lockdown. So we're going to do some different stuff, and we thought we could try this. And again, they were just really encouraging and let me kind of do it my own way, really. So that, which at this point, if I'm going to collaborate with anybody on Looking Sideways, like is like, that's the it would need to be done like that, because I'm never going to go into something unless I feel like I've got control, really. So yeah, I think it's been great. I think it's been a really good addition. It's been good for me to explore that topic as well, because again, I've, obviously that podcast is about sustainability and activism, and I've learned a lot from doing it, and that was another reason why it was quite appealing, because, obviously I know a little bit about, probably like everyone, I feel like I'm sort of fairly informed, but it was a good excuse to sort of throw myself into it as well, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess that would have, brought a lot of things up. I feel like, I'd love to hear your take on this. We've spoke a lot about your history in snowboarding. I used to love snowboarding. It was like my jam. I grew up skating as well, and then like went and did snowboarding, and incredibly lucky to have had the opportunity to do that. It's a pretty privileged space to even like consider as part of your life. And then, yeah, I'd love to kind of hear your take on the whole environmental side of action sports. And, like it's a pretty confronting thing when you're like, hey dude, I know you love snowboarding, but think about it. Like they're a ski resort on the top of a mountain, which is not easy to get to. And you're like,
well, they're islands for rich people. I mean, let's make no bones about it. Like yeah. I mean, our news section in Whitelines was called Thieves and Rich Kids, because that's the only people that could afford to do it. We definitely put ourselves in the thieves camp. Yeah, like it's obviously, I'm aware there's a huge contradiction in that. My thoughts on it are that I don't know how sustainable that contradiction is long term, really. I feel like if you can actually take action on climate change, this is not going to make me very popular. I don't know if you can find a place for those things, really, to be honest. But then, having said that, one of the themes that's, one more thing I'll say about that is I've got friends that protect our winters, and they certainly know my views on that. Like I've spoken to them about this and kind of been quite forthright about that, really. Personally, yeah, like my lifestyle is massively not coherent with that, and it's something I think this period's made me realize, because can't travel now, And to be honest, it's just something I've been thinking for a while. Like the amount I travel personally is just fucking ludicrous and not really, just not acceptable really. So I think this kind of made the decision for me, because let's be frank, international travel is probably a couple of years away, isn't it? Really, the way we're going. But like the other thing I was going to say is on the wider issue, I kind of feel like the whole climate change conversation and any long-term change and this is a theme that comes out in Type 2 every single episode from successful activists. You have to win the middle ground. You can't hit people over the head with, like I just did, well, you're not going to be able to go skiing and snowboarding anymore. Unfortunately, because people don't want their lives to change that dramatically, as we're seeing with this situation. Like you have literally got people in America right now demanding the right to potentially get infected by a fatal virus. There's 100,000 people or whatever it is dead, and people are still able to have the cognitive dissonance to say, well, I don't give a fuck. That's not going to affect me. I want to do what I want to do. So when you look at climate change in that context, which is a much more nebulous threat, if you like, it's a concept, isn't it? I understand that people are affected by climate change, obviously, but for most people it's still just an idea, really, isn't it? It's an ideology. It's like you either believe it or you don't. It's a flag to plant in the ground and to stand behind. The people that don't believe it are not going to be persuaded by being told they can't go skiing or snowboarding. In the same way, the people that are susceptible to not really believing coronavirus is that much of a threat aren't susceptible to being told that there's 100,000 people just died. You've got to deal with that side of human nature. That's my point. And that's a massive challenge for that movement, because I've been lucky enough to speak to like massively passionate people in that space who are all in. I've spoken to a guy called Fergal Smith, not for Type 2, but for the podcast. He's a really well-known Irish surfer. He's quit travel. Like, he's not traveled for 5 years. He's quit he gave up his professional surfing contract. He now runs an organic community farm on the west coast of Ireland. He has walked it like he's talked it. And I've got massive respect for that and for anybody that can do that. But I personally feel that to win that argument, you've got to persuade the majority of people that it's in their best interest to win that fight. I don't really see that happening right now from that movement. And I think the most successful movements are the ones that have persuaded that middle ground that it is in their best interest to make the change that's required. And that's a massive challenge. And I think, like I say, if you say to people like, those leisure activities that you really like, you're not going to be able to do them anymore, I don't think that's going to win any argument, to be honest, unfortunately, because it's human nature. So I feel like unpicking that conundrum at the heart of this is the challenge that movement faces. And let's be frank, and I'm guessing probably you, as much as I do make good choices a lot of the time, try not to eat meat, try not to drive that much, recycle, I'm talking about cutting down my travel. I'm probably in that middle ground camp, to be honest, if I'm being frank. I'm certainly probably further to the left of that argument, if you like, but I feel like that's the challenge ahead, really. And I don't really hear many people addressing that. What I hear is like regime change, not system change. Like the very like, whatever that slogan is, the very kind of absolutist, like, we need to do this or else we're all fucked. I don't, like, let me just say, I obviously believe in the cause of climate change. I believe it's real. I'm just looking at this quite dispassionately from what I've kind of learned from doing those podcasts and what I kind of see, really. And I do think the coronavirus thing is a fucking frightening metaphor for that. Because if you're not going to get change when there's people literally dropping dead like flies, when the fuck are you going to get change?
Yeah, man, it's a pretty stark reality to it all. It's like, this is happening, and what are you going to do about it? You got choices to make, and I've seen a lot of things like Mother Earth is having a bit of rest period right now because of all this, and a lot of it I definitely resonate with, and I believe it's probably true. And like you said, when things get lifted and everyone has the freedom to get back to normal, a lot of people are still gonna want to go and get out and do the things they love doing. And
yeah, I mean, probably even more so. Yeah, and I talked to a friend of mine at Protect Our Winters the other day about that argument that you just raised. Like, you see all these memes that are like, this is Mother Earth's way of tying us all to, like, fact of the matter is, like, people do live on this planet and people do have like an economic system in place, which I don't agree with. Like, I'm, as you might be able to tell, pretty left wing, like, but you can't just not try and deal with that again, like's happening with this situation we've got now. Like we chatted about at the very beginning of the conversation, people need to work. Unfortunately, people have like there is an economic requirement, and I'd love to see it change, but you've got to deal with that. And the argument's always a bit like, well, we'll change those industries for like renewable industries, and I don't know enough about that to know whether that's even viable or not. I just do know that if anything like that is ever conceivably going to happen, you're going to require like incredibly strong leadership to get that through. Because, and we don't have that now, which is like perhaps in some countries they do have that leadership, but I think in a lot of the sort of headline countries, particularly the UK and the States, like we clearly don't really have that leadership that's got the ability to do that. What they're talking about is, fucking hell, we need to turn the economy on again or we're all fucked, and how many lives are we prepared to sacrifice for that? It's quite a long way really from actual system change, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of powers pulling a lot of directions right now, and I think the human life is obviously being put at the forefront, and it's going to be really interesting to see when human life starts to get equally compared to, like you say, like the economy, and that's going to be really telling to a lot of things.
It's literally happening in America right now, isn't it? They are basically saying like, we are prepared to let people die so that we can all go and get a tattoo. Yeah, I mean that's what they're saying. It's quite mind blowing.
Yeah, and like I think there is something to be said about getting outside. A lot of people have had that privilege taken away from them, getting outside doing sport. It doesn't have to be snowboarding or surfing or anything like that, but just getting outside and running or walking, going to the PT and the gym and stuff like that. It's all been taken away, which I think has a huge effect on people's mental stability, and be able to like have that whole element of being human is like a really big thing. And after all the people that you've been able to speak to in sports, how much of their drive, if there is a generalization, is linked to them being like, you know what, it just makes me feel good. It's just my like human instinct coming through, and it saves me as a person. Because I'm sure
I think there are loads of themes like that. Yeah, I think you're right.
Have you been like subject to or been able to uncover some of those stories which have really just kind of like taken you aback and been like, well, this guy is the greatest in the world at doing what he does, when you put a board underneath his feet, or a lady, she's the best in the world, but like, whoa, it's driven from a pretty intense place.
Yeah, very frequently. I mean, Jamie Thomas springs to mind, like the skateboarder who, clearly for him, skateboarding was it was a community. The theme of community is huge. The theme of like people at a formative age needing what that community that they discovered gives them is huge. And it was particularly acute in his case. And I think what was interesting about his story is, sorry, my dog might bark. He's on the bed. As his career came to a conclusion, his self-image and self-esteem was so wrapped up in being a skateboarder and what that skateboarding community gave him, that when it started to basically, it's the professional athlete retires kind of trope, but he really struggled with that because it was like, well, who am I? If I'm not that guy, who am I? And again, that's a pretty common story for any professional athlete, I think. There we go. Sorry. Just let him out.
Dog's just given us his 2 cents on how he thinks the evolution of the coronavirus is going to go. And I think he is agreeing that it's probably going to turn out okay.
Almost forgot he was there. So yeah, that was really interesting with Jamie because he was, he was, like I say, he was particularly kind of acute case of that theme that you get.
Yeah, and I think it's just part and parcel of sometimes being like excessively good at a certain thing. There's something very, very deep that drives that. And like I touched on before, there's a lot of human nature in that whole sphere of a sport that is hard to explain sometimes. It comes from a very deep place that it's just a drive that is natural that people use to propel themselves to the best that they can be.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, man, just the final thing, two things. You just touched on it before, like community and culture. That is something that must be like so important to a sport and so important going forward. But like, have you seen any examples that really kind of blew you away in regards to how a community can be so, so powerful in its voice when it's up against something that might be threatening, for instance, if a certain like surf break was going to get closed down, but the community was like, nah, not going to happen. Like throughout your time, have you seen the power of community like that?
Well, probably the fight for the buy, in Australia, like in recent times, which is just, about that story?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like pretty well. It's
exactly. It's near you, right? So, I'd say that was like a huge, amazing example of what you've just described, because that's a proper David and Goliath story. Huge Norwegian oil company looking to, not even like a surf break, it's like a whole wilderness and environment, isn't it?
Mm.
And I'm quite pally with Belinda Baggs, who's really involved in that campaign. And I spoke to her last week, and she was saying that they just couldn't believe it had been a success, basically, really. When they actually pulled out Equinor, they were like, oh, wow, we did it, So yeah, I think that was brilliant. And that was a really great example of how a campaign can succeed, by hitting that middle ground that I described earlier.
Yeah, right on. Now I'm so stoked you brought that one up. That's awesome. And the final, mate, like, got to wrap it up. Let you get on with your day.
All good.
Is do you want to leave anyone listening to this? I'm sure there's heaps, mate. But do you want to leave them with anything to ponder and think about?
Well, funnily enough, a friend of mine asked me something the other day. He's like, what would you have told your 14-year-old self for a book that he's writing? And maybe that would... So one of the things I said was something that me and Terry Harkinson talked about in our podcast, which was something he said, when you get older, like, you realize no one gives a fuck what you think, which is, I think, very worth realizing as early as possible. And then kind of related to that is something I read recently, which is like, no one cares how clever you think you are. And I think that's another thing that is very important to get in your head as early as possible, because that's very true. And it can affect a lot of things in your life. That if you were going to ask me to throw out something, it'd probably be that, really.
That's rad, man. I think that that is definitely something to remember. It's almost tattoo worthy, the tattoos you were talking about before.
Hey, nice to chat, man.
Thanks so much, Matt. I really appreciate it, man. And once again, like, yeah, I said it before, the content you put out there with Looking Sideways is truly awesome, and it just provides some great conversations, great insights, and please continue to do it.
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind words, mate. I really appreciate it. All right, mate.
Thanks, mate. You too. Cheers.
Well, there we have it, guys. Another episode of Stokely for you to connect with, listen, learn, and evolve from. So I hope you enjoyed it. Matt really does some incredible work over at his podcast, Looking Sideways, and Type 2. I highly encourage you to check those out. Thanks a lot for your time. Please let us know what you think at Stokely Podcast on Instagram. And until next time, stay safe out there, continue to be brave, kind, and awkward, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you.